that I sent out to you here, which is the whole of the letter sort of laid out. I think it's very helpful to be able to see it sort of in a tabulated form, and also something to continually refer back to. Also, as a pure mnemonic device, if you're trying to remember what Romans is about, it's easier if you see its internal structure, its architecture, and you think, oh, okay, instead of having to worry about all 16 chapters, I have reduced it to 4 sections. So if I can, and there's a pattern to them, right? It's not my pattern. I don't think it's my pattern. It seems to me the fact that Paul is introducing particular problems and then providing God's salvation, his deliverance to these particular problems, is embedded right into the very argument. So it's a nice, simple, it actually is a very helpful way for the apostle to help us as readers once we detect what his sort of argument structure is. It then makes it easier to follow the little details of the argument. And of course, each of the sections end with a similar set of themes. The glory of God is, of course, expressly talked about at the end of in the middle of chapter 5, and then at the end of chapter 8, the end of chapter 11, and the end of chapter 16. All places have references to the word glory. If you go and look through a word study and look up the word glory and where it occurs in the letter, you'll find that there are very, very few to none references to the glory of God in between these parts. So Paul reserves a discussion of God's glory for the most part till the end of these sections. And then the other theme, that the first half of the book is centered on the love of God, and the second half of the book is on the wisdom of God, which raises a question already, doesn't it? Why? Why is the love of God so important in the first half of the book, but the wisdom of God is a key idea, the more dominant idea? And of course, both of these, in all 4 of these climactic sections at the end of each of the sections, where it talks about the love of God, talks about the wisdom of God, it's in doxological sections, right? It's in sections where Paul is beginning to reflect upon the sheer glory of God and of the particular attributes of God's glory. And in one, and
2 sides of the same coin, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, they are. I mean, in one sense, it's heart and mind, to put it simply. But why mind in the second half of the letter? What is it about the big sections in the second half of the letter that draw Paul's thoughts toward the wisdom of God? Whereas in the first half of the letter, he's drawn toward the love of God. I'm not even remotely going to try and answer that right now. I'm only saying, just looking at the map of what's written, which is hopefully all this is it already raises some questions to think about. Also, when it talks about the love of God at the end of chapter 8, does it talk about the love of God the same way in chapter 5? Interestingly, on both occasions, the love of God becomes part of the argument. He's not just mentioning the love of God. He's not just saying, the love of God is awesome. He's incorporating it into his very argument, right? God demonstrates his love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. How much more then, given that demonstration of love, can we then conclude this next thing? So the love of God becomes incorporated into the very argument. All right, so that's now another thing to ponder and to consider. Yeah.
Well, I put forth that the culture that he's speaking is not understand what love of God is. And so he then goes to what they think is very important, would be wisdom.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's a good point. Mm-hmm.
Attacking the same problem from two different angles. And the world at that time, the love of God was not what they considered love to be.
Yeah.
And really didn't.
Yeah, it's true. Love wasn't valued in the same way it was in the Judeo and Christian tradition. Although Romans wasn't Athens either. So the wisdom is a Greek thing, you know. Philosophia, you know.
Love of wisdom still, I mean, the Romans inculcated that same.
They did, yeah. They made an attempt. But you know, the attempt they made is a little bit like the American attempt to imitate the Brits. There's a reason Americans feel intimidated when they talk to somebody with a British accent. You know, so and the British are quite happy to let that intimidation hang in the air. So, and who can blame them? Yeah. So those are questions anyways that I think already we still have yet. They're just lingering out there. We're going to have to address at some point. Now, another thing that is really quite independent from the actual argument of the letter, but relates to the text of the letter. So we don't talk about this very much because, say, in the text of the Revelation or the text of, what did we do? John. Well, we did have one textual issue in John, which was the story of the adulteress. But in Romans, we have a pretty massive textual question. And it's maybe one you're not even familiar with. But the end of the letter is missing. And by the end, I mean 16. And perhaps more, is missing from a very few number, but some copies of the letter. This has led to a lot of different theories to explain why is it missing, or was it originally missing and then somebody added it. So there's lots of different theories about what do we do with the fact that there's some a handful of manuscripts that have some, and there's some just anomalies where the doxology comes at the end and so on. There's just a couple anomalies. It's clear that the ending of the letter suffered some disruption in its transmission. That's early on, very early on. And so I've just simply let you, inform you of it. The fact that a lot of these, what would have been written probably on scrolls initially, I mean, maybe they were written in codices in book form, but certainly they were transferred into book form very early on, because our earliest copies are virtually all books, the book form. And as you can imagine, just like an old Bible, it's not uncommon to lose the front page and the last page. That's a fairly common way, since it's on the outside of the text, for it to be damaged. It's possible that played a role in why the last page, it also may have played a role in the ending of Mark, for all we know, which is also somewhat unstable, somewhat. And then we also have comments from some of the earliest fathers that one of the early heretics named Marcion, somebody who lived in the early 2nd century AD. So think early 100s, 110, 120, and so on. He's operating within Rome. And in the latter half of that century, that same century, we have some fathers, church fathers, who say that he removed the last part of Romans. So it could be that Marcion's copies, since initially Marcion was within the churches of Rome, operating initially within the churches of Rome, and then later, was abandoned because he held ideas. He, by the way, is the first one on record to hold the position that the God of the Old Testament was barbaric and simply couldn't be Jesus. That's right. Yes. See,
The Jewish.
that's right. He apparently focused solely on the Gospel of Luke, or at least primarily on the Gospel of Luke, and altered its text to diminish the background of the Jewish background, the Jewish contribution, the Old Testament, things like that. So that's highly problematic. But of course, since he was within churches initially, it could be that his initial copy of Romans, where he said, "Look, we don't need the ending here," which has some things about, particularly in chapter 15, about Jews and Gentiles being in one body with one voice speaking in praise to God. Maybe that was a motivation, who knows? But it could also be that somebody thought that all of those greetings at the end of the letter with all the names, that when they made the copy and they got to that point, they were like, well, we're going to go give this over to the church in Philippi, and I don't think they're going to care about all these names, and they just left it off. I mean, the reality is, people who knows what, I think we know what people are capable of. So the reality is that some copies dropped the ending, the final chapter or two, and then it circulated like that in some small capacity. Obviously, the vast majority of our manuscripts don't have those anomalies. But there are many scholars who think the original copy of Romans ended before the end of 16, and that the end of 16 was added later. Yeah.
When the Marcionitic Church was finally pushed out, people that followed Marcion said, well, there's a whole lot more letters of Paul than we have. And actually, the comments, not your comments, but the comments from people at the time that stayed in the church said, well, thus and so and nothing but so he left stuff out. Sounds to me like a counter argument to the fact that, well, there's another 20 letters of Paul that Marcion had said.
I thought it was smaller myself, his canon, but yeah.
In addition, the Dutch Radical School said that the whole of Rome, the book of Romans, was written in the same form that the Roman diplomatic corps used.
Yes, that is correct. By the way, can you guys hear Shannon? Like Michael, can you hear Shannon? No? Okay. I just was seeing if he could hear you. He's talking about the Marcion, this early father who was a heretic, and sort of some of his practices. All that could have played a role, in some way. The way textual critics look at it, right, is they lay out all the evidence. They try to collect as many manuscripts as possible and just look at the data, and then try to come up with ways to explain it, both in terms of its sort of chronological trajectory, combined with the comments of the fathers and the particular parts that were altered. And my own view of it is that there's no really one good, clean explanation that sort of accounts for every anomaly. There's, I think the general view held by most Christians is that the original text did include chapters 15 and 16, and that it was altered probably by Marcion, and that affected the stream of the copies within the tradition, even in some of the Orthodox churches, particularly because Marcion wasn't initially viewed as a heretic. So that's I think a common view, and I think it's a reasonable one. It's not a definitive view. Now, there's another thing which is just my own looking at it. Okay, so this is, it's easy to give your own opinion when you don't have to publish it in a journal, and it's especially easy to be really confident about it. But if you look at the internal structure of the letter, I don't see why we should rule that out as a factor in analyzing the textual issues. But if you look at, when you look at how each of the sections end, you'll notice I put quotes around these words, the love of God, the wisdom of God. These are quotes. I mean, I'm not making it up. It's not my interpretation that at the end of chapter 11, Paul speaks of the wisdom of God in the context of a doxology. I mean, that's right there in the text for anybody to read. It's part of a larger theme of discussion of glory at the end of each of the main arguments. So we have a chance to test our theory, does a discussion of the wisdom and glory of God surface, say, at the end of chapter 14 or the middle of chapter 15? And that's the original ending. Well, it turns out that it's in the final 2 verses of the letter, as we have the letter, that there's another doxology, and it discusses the wisdom of God. And that just happens to line up with the pattern we saw earlier in the letter. So if you say to me, well, chapters 15 and 16 or 16 weren't original to the letter, I would say, well, man, whoever added 16 was really a genius. Or worse, the original ending, which should have been there, is gone, and they replaced it, like coming up to a ancient Greek temple and saying, well, there's 8 pillars on this side, and there's only 7 on the other. I think what we need to do is add 1 more pillar here because it should match the other side. In other words, where there's a pattern already begun, then you would think it would follow through to the end. So it seems to me that just even the internal, in other words, not only the normal text critical arguments that people use are strongly in support of the original letter having all 16 chapters. I think that's true. But in addition to that, another layer of evidence would be that the internal architecture has a very distinct pattern to it. And so long as you include chapter 16 in the letter, then it fits the structure. So would be another piece of evidence, I think, that's in favor of the traditional thing. But anyway, I just thought you should be aware of it. Occasionally I'm talking to the non-believing world, and they're aware of things like this. And it's sort of nice to have had some exposure. You'll notice I'm not being dogmatic. I'm not saying, hey, there's no question, at all. I think there is a question, but I don't think it's a very challenging one to the traditional letter. Okay, so that's that. Now we have here the text I sent out to you, which I don't know if it's going to be of much value to you. It's just something I'm going to use, which is the whole of the letter here. But I have added some of the sort of argument headings. Okay, and so if you print that out, it's going to be 15 or 18 pages or something like that. And I don't know if you feel like you need to do that. If you have the map, you have the same thing anyway in the map. So all I did was just kind of lay out the sort of headings. And just to catch us up before we start into verse 1, I suggested that the aim the Apostle Paul had in mind is best understood in light of his evangelical campaigns. He was on a mission. For him, there was no Christianity apart from being an evangelist. That doesn't mean you had the gifts of an evangelist, but the burden of being a spokesman for God in the world, of the salvation of God, was a burden every Christian shared. And Paul put his best energies in life toward his evangelical campaigns, which included shoring up the churches he had founded or been a part of, or simply had connections to reaffirm and to strengthen those churches, was part of his mission, of course. What's the point of sowing a bunch of seed in the field and then just leaving it to die in the sun in the summer without watering it. There's no point in it. So it seems to me, since he's going to be passing through Rome on his way to Spain, and he's asking the Romans, who are going to be a very huge force in the history of the church. It's not just New York City, gentlemen. There's no equivalent to Rome in the modern world. It was so much bigger than every other city. It's just so. Imagine what our biggest cities. What are the biggest cities in China? 15 billion or something, or million or something like that. I don't know, 20 million. I'm not sure what the numbers are, but they're pretty high. But then imagine there's a city with 4 times that population somewhere. We just don't have anything quite like that. So Rome was just so dominant, and so he's wanting to conscript the church into his helping him with his mission to some degree, and to encourage them to become a part of that mission, not just because he's self-interested. This isn't Paul putting a 1-800 number on the end of a letter, so to speak, so he can raise some funds. This is Paul, who's interested in the larger strategy of establishing the gospel throughout the world, and Rome is the place where all roads lead. So it's crucial that the Roman Christians have an unwavering confidence in the faith, that they're not ashamed, regardless of the pressures, which would be great in the city itself. Because everybody in the city thought the same, didn't they? You know how those big cities are? What was it? I remember after George W. Bush won the election in 2004, they were interviewing a lady on TV from Manhattan, Upper East Side, Manhattan. And she said, "I have no idea how George Bush won the election. I don't know a single person who voted for him." Well, yeah, because if that's where you lived, you wouldn't expect, that there would be a lot of Bush, supporters in that particular region. Lots of pressures, and so it seems to me that's what he's interested in. He's aiming at trying to shore up their confidence in the gospel. He himself has had to bear witness about the gospel to kings and princes and governors. And Paul knows the challenge that is involved in that. There are a lot of smart people in Rome, a lot of sharp people, a lot of education in Rome. And it's simply going to be a little higher bar to defend the faith in that context than it might be in some other contexts. So it seems to me, anyway, that all of these may be some factors in explaining what is the obvious theme, to me seems obvious, which is the 4 sections all are intended in one way or another to buttress and shore up our fundamental confidence in God and the gospel message itself, so that we might feel the more empowered to proclaim it and to defend it to the people around us. So we'll now just kind of start line by line, not forgetting that in the first section here, the argument is quickly going to turn to the question of the wrath of God. But that's not, of course, how it begins in the intro. Paul can hardly put his pen down before he starts writing about the gospel. Don't get me wrong. He's already begun the theme of his letter in the first verse. Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God. He's already on the theme of the gospel. And what does he say about the gospel? Which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh and was declared to be the Son of God in power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of his name among all the nations, including you, who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. All those in Rome who are loved by God and called to be saints, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. So verse 7 is the more standard way you greet somebody in a letter. It was common. We have, you know, little papyrus letters, right, from the ancient world, private letters, and some of them are fairly short, and many of them, the first lines, the beginning is just simply the statement to so and so, you know, excuse me, the name of the person and then to whom it's addressed to. Okay, a little different from the way we do it. We put the person we're addressing first rather than our name first. I don't write you, when I write you an email on Thursdays, I don't say Bill, a teacher, to whatever. But that was their format. The esteemed gentleman, I should have added, to the esteemed gentleman. But my point is that he spends 6 verses on, he starts with his name, but he spends 6 verses on the explaining a few things, because it's going to set the themes out quickly. One of the major themes. He is set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised. Now, which he promised beforehand, actually, through his prophets. I think we all know what this means, right? I mean, God made a promise. Yeah. He did it beforehand. That's before, like Jesus, I think he means that. And that it was through his prophets. Yep, got that. And obviously recorded in the holy writings. I don't think any of us have any problems in figuring out what it means, but why is he talking about this?
Other than the Jew.
So first answer is these Christians wouldn't have the background of sort of the Old Testament, the Torah, and so, or the Tanakh, I mean, and so so that would be one reason he's going to emphasize that. Now, were there Jews in this church? In these churches in Rome? Yeah. There's some debate whether it wasn't predominantly Jewish because of how much of the Old Testament is wielded throughout the letter. But there's no question throughout the letter that there are clearly both Gentiles and Jews in the church. Yeah. Well, I guess I would think the reverse myself, but nonetheless, even in the names, which are predominantly Gentile, but of course, you know, this is writing to Rome, so you know, you all know Josephus as Josephus, which is a Latin name because Vespasian took him to Rome and gave him a nice villa, you know, to write his histories, and he took the name, a Latin name. So it's not so clear the names are a big enough indication, but just the letter itself, I mean, there's clearly Jews and Gentiles in the churches. At least we can say that much, given the topics he addresses and what he says to specific groups. So I'm not in disagreement that it's important to emphasize it. I'm just saying that it does seem like there are Jews and Gentiles in the church. Maybe the Gentiles are would be less equipped with the knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures, understandably. But you know, it's amazing. It doesn't take that long. It doesn't have to take that long. I remember the first few months I started going to a church. I was visiting a church. I was not a Christian yet, and was still telling people that I was an atheist, you know. And I would visit this one little church, and this is in university. And I didn't, you know, I would ask people questions, you know, like this, when Jesus was in Capernaum, you know, Like, I didn't know how to say these words or anything, you know? And, but, you know, a year later, I think I'd read the Bible twice. You know, I devoured it pretty fast, and read it again and again and again. And, you know, I started memorizing a lot. Like a year and a half after I was a Christian, just looking back, I think, you know, I knew a surprising amount for a year and a half. In other words, it doesn't have to take 10 years for people to learn, you know, learn fast. Anyway, so anyway, why else might, I think it's a reasonable suggestion, by the way, from Shannon. But what else might explain why he immediately launches into the emphasis on the fact that the gospel was promised beforehand?
To authenticate the eternal quality of what he's preaching about.
The eternal quality of it? Yeah. Okay, I think that's true, to show that it has an enduring value. And what was yours, David? Yeah, right. He keeps his promises, right? Because obviously he's telling about what was promised that has become a reality. But if I asked you, how does this relate to the little heading here? Again, maybe I'm wrong about how the letter is to be interpreted. So, but at least you can say in verse 16, he's talking about how he's not ashamed of the gospel. And there's quite a bit throughout the letter about confidence. So how might this relate to our confidence in the gospel? If we grant for a moment that might be the major theme of the letter, how might this idea in verse 2 relate to it? Because, you know, Paul could have said 10 different things about the gospel. Instead, he emphasized that it was promised beforehand through the prophets in the scriptures. But how might that relate to our confidence?
So, yeah, Bill, if you were trying to, there was obviously maybe not a consistent vigor about it. So, you know, you would put something in if you felt like you needed to clarify something, or so there obviously was not a, you know, he didn't feel that there was that confidence there.
Right.
It boosts your confidence. How?
Well, if he's so confident, he's a pretty smart guy. Maybe need to.
No, I mean, how does the promise itself, the discussion of the promise?
Saying that this fulfills the promises that he made X thousands or hundreds of years ago. And Paul was trying to cite that this is a believable promise that I'm fixing to tell you about in the future.
But the statement we're talking about is what has been fulfilled. Then anything in the future also applies. That's your point. Yeah, then it also gives you confidence for the future. That is true. Well, let me ask you this. Does it help your confidence at all in the gospel that it was promised beforehand? In writing? There's a reason we say, I'll get that in writing. Does it matter to you? Let me ask you this. Did it matter to the evangelists who wrote the Gospels, those books we call the Gospels? Did it matter to them? When they begin their Gospels, does it matter? I mean, how does Mark begin his Gospel? With a quote from the Old Testament. That's the opening of his Gospel. And what about the opening of Matthew? What's that all about?
Genesis.
It's the genealogy going back through the Old Testament. And then it tells you about, with a very small paragraph, it tells you about how Mary has conceived and an angel has revealed what the name of Jesus is going to be, because he's going to be born of a virgin. And then at the very end of that very small first narrative paragraph, there's a quotation from the Old Testament. You shall call his name Emmanuel. The virgin shall conceive. In fact, the second story in Matthew includes a quotation from the Old Testament, as does the third and the fourth.
Since, I mean, if you're going to reference the Old Testament, and since the Old Testament goes all the way back to the creation of life, right, and everything,
Yeah.
than to say that we're gonna promise that even though you die, you're gonna resurrect. It becomes a little more believable if you're saying that we're following the same God that created everything.
Yeah, I think that's true. That that the very beginnings of the story, so to speak, come round at the end. But yeah, it seems, I think maybe it's just so obvious, that the fact that God made promises which are in writing in the Old Testament, writings which nobody disputes, not the most liberal scholar in the world is disputing that, say, the book of Isaiah was written before the time of Jesus. Okay? Or that the book of Deuteronomy or what have you was written before the times of Jesus. We have these books which predate the birth, life, ministry of both Jesus and of John the Baptizer. And yet those very scriptures said certain things were going to happen, which happened through the pairing of John the Baptizer and Jesus. Remember, they're a pair. Not one evangelist fails to begin their gospel with an extended discussion of John the Baptizer. He's a necessary part. And all of them quote Isaiah or Malachi in validating that there needed to be a forerunner. Without a forerunner, there is no credibility for the messianic claims. There has to be somebody coming before the Messiah. And that somebody was John the Baptizer. And you can't orchestrate that. You know what I mean? I mean, John the Baptizer was wildly popular. Even Josephus, who was a Pharisee, decades after Jesus. So you might think that he would have reason to disregard John the Baptizer because of his connections with Jesus. But Josephus in his history tells us that John the Baptist was a wildly popular prophetic figure. And that God at one point, the Jews widely believed that God punished Herod later for his execution of John. Well, anyone know how to execute becoming a celebrity? Anyone know how to accomplish that? Like, say I wanted to be a celebrity, modest claim. I'd like to be a celebrity in the next couple of years. Anybody here, let's say I had $1 billion. Can I give that $1 billion to anybody and be guaranteed to become a celebrity? I mean, maybe just the giving of the $1 billion might help, but you know what I'm saying. Let's say it was private, what is there anybody who has the formula that automatically turns you into a celebrity? I don't think so. Anybody know a company that automatically can create a viral sensation? I mean, everybody's trying to do it. There's no perfect formula. Not even Apple can create an automatic, and they're about as close as you get. Anyway, so to just become as widely influential as John the Baptizer was is not something you engineer. It's not like these cousins, Jesus and John, got together when they were young and said, hey, I have an idea. And then they just got lucky and it worked. I mean, it's possible. I'm not saying that's impossible. It's very implausible. I'm older, but I'll be your sidekick. And you will be be viewed as the Messiah. And not only am I going to be wildly popular, everyone will love you, well, for a while, and you'll become really wildly popular. And then it'll all go down the drain, and then it'll end up fulfilling scripture all the same. I mean, these are not things, it's too convoluted. It has too many moving parts to orchestrate it. There's too many scriptures. I mean, the end of Daniel 9 gives us a time frame, a chronological time frame, from the time the decree goes forth to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem to the Messiah. It gives the time frame of 490 years. Well, that just happened to work out. So that gives confidence when Paul presses his case. what does he do? He presses the case from the scriptures. When Paul writes to the Corinthians, and in chapter 15, he explains the gospel in very concise terms. You remember what he says? He says, this happened with Jesus according to the scriptures, right? Tom's right. And then he was buried, and then he was raised from the dead according to the writings. So this is a really thick, heavy, massive pylon underneath the bridge of our confidence. So anyway, it seems to me that's why he's bringing up the topic.
You know, it'd be like me going to you and say, give me all your money, and I've got this idea of how I can really do it.
I have a literal bridge you can buy.
But if you say, you know, I've done it for this guy, and it's provable, you would have more confidence to do that. Just like he's said, this is not just some harebrained idea I came up with, but here is a history of everything that's happened.
Yes, that's right.
Trust.
Yeah, Bill's saying you'd be susceptible to the easy charge that you've just invented all this. It's a lot harder when you say, no, this has been going on for centuries and centuries, and this is the culmination, and you can follow the trajectory, and you can follow the templates. Does the Old Testament have any stories of salvation? Does God do any delivering in the Old Testament? A little bit, yeah. Delivers people in the story of Noah, delivers people in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, delivers people from Egypt, delivers people from Jericho, delivers. And those salvations are like little brochures you take on a trip. Well, we used to take on a trip. You know, you're going to go stay in well, it still works this way. You know, Jenny and I stayed in an Airbnb up in Coleman a couple weeks ago for a night, and you know, we saw it online, right? We saw the pictures online, and then we get the directions to go there. It was you know, way off of you know, behind this normal neighborhood, and you had to go through all these dormant chicken coops, you know, like to drive through all this area. And then thankfully there were no chickens still there. And then you go past all this stuff, and eventually you get to this little house sitting in the middle of nowhere and looking over a valley. And when you see the house, here's your phone, here's the picture you saw of it, and sure enough, but there might be a little surprise or two, you know, about it. But you can confirm it's the same thing you saw in picture form ahead of time. So the Old Testament is laying out various pictures from different angles of the nature of God's salvation, the nature of God's Messiah. Sometimes those pictures are very expressly stated as predictions. One of them was the Messiah would be a direct blood descendant of King David. That's an explicit prediction concerning the Messiah. Not just is it implied in Samuel, but you also have these odd psalms which Jesus called people's attention to. The Lord said to my Lord, a psalm of David. And Jesus said, well, why is David referring to the Messiah as my Lord? How could he do that? Isn't he his son? Nobody disputed that. Everybody, you'll notice, nobody disputed that element of the question. The Jews widely believed the Messiah had to be a descendant of David, or without that fulfillment of a very precise prediction, he is DQ'd. He cannot qualify as Messiah. So Paul says in verse 3, this gospel concerned God's Son. Well, before we even get to David, let's stop there. Anything in the Old Testament about the Son? Explicit in the Old Testament about the Son? The what?
Well, see, Eve.
Yeah. First of all, the child, the offspring of the woman. that God promised that a human offspring would be the instrument of defeating the devil and the enemy of humanity. That God himself would conscript a human. Turns out it was God himself as a human. Anybody ever read Psalm 2? Because it's quoted in Acts. What'd you say, Tom? Why do the nations rage and the people imagine vain things? It's quoted in the book of Acts when they're praying after the resurrection and they're beginning to be persecuted. And you remember the exact wording at the end of that psalm? How shall the nations avoid the wrath of God? You'll note the context. It's not the nation, Israel. It's Gentile nations. How shall Gentile nations avoid facing the wrath of God when they have raged against him and his anointed, his Messiah? You know what it says in Psalm 2? Kiss the Son, S-O-N, lest he be angry and you perish in the way. That's Psalm 2. Well, that was written long before Jesus ever showed up. All right. Concerning his son. That wasn't just a New Testament concern, but an Old Testament concern. Who was descended from David, according to the flesh anyway. And we've already talked about that. Another explicit prediction from Old Testament scriptures. Jesus had to be the descendant of David. And two of the evangelists provide the genealogical records that point to the fact that Jesus is a descendant of David. Now, you might not think this is unimportant. I meet a lot of Christians. They sometimes don't think these things are important, but the unbelievers think it's important. The non-believing world is keen to these genealogies. They know, intuitively know, that it helps Jesus's case, doesn't it? And therefore, there has been a lot of looking at these genealogies, because even to a casual reader, when you look at the genealogy in Luke chapter 3 and line it up with the genealogy with Matthew in chapter 1, there's some differences after David, right? The differences are all after David. Both genealogies are traced to David, however. There's no controversy at that. But to get to David, it's two different routes. And there have been a lot of theories about why that is. It's almost a Rorschach test, you know. If you see that they're different, then that must mean they're made up, if you're a non-believing skeptic. If you're a Christian, well, that's easily explained. One genealogy is going through Joseph and one's going through Mary. That's what Christians usually say. I'm not so persuaded of either position myself, because Luke tells you his genealogies from Joseph. So I don't know why I should come along and say it's through Mary when he tells us it's through Joseph. But the thing that's lost in the debate is that genealogical records were public records. Luke, as is clear, takes his genealogy from the Old Testament, at least most of it. But genealogies are public records, meaning in ancient Israel, in the times of Jesus, of course, they kept the genealogical records. When you read different Old Testament writings from very different periods, right? Whether you're reading Genesis, whether you're reading Ezra, you have genealogical records. They kept the genealogical records. You know why? See, you and I, we own our piece of property. And sometimes there's a dispute where your final line should be in your mowing, you know, or if you're going to build a shed, right? And how do you resolve that difference? What if you say, well, I should be able to build a shed right up to here, you know, according to code or whatever. And your neighbor says, no, you can't do that. I think, was it Rand Paul that had a neighbor that was in some dispute with him, apparently, about where to cut the lawn? So what do we do then? We go down to the official public records offices and we look at the maps of the property lines and so on. But how do they determine the properties in ancient Israel? It's tied to the genealogical records going back all the way to Joshua. So it was part of your family's history, what land you owned. Your genealogies related to your material investments and inheritance and so on. So anyway, we know they kept genealogical records. We know that, of course, also from Josephus. So genealogical records were publicly kept. It was easy to refute a genealogical record if it was concocted or manufactured. So it seems to me, regardless of what your explanation is for why they're different, I don't think myself we have an explanation, my own view. Meaning, I don't think we know the explanation. There are many possible explanations. It's not like it's that hard to explain why you might have different, because, you know, it turns out that when a family, you have two lines of a family, it turns out they don't all stay away from one another. That occasionally they reconnect through cousins and second cousins and all sorts of things. They can connect, right? I won't go into my family history, but there's some very interesting things in my family history. And of course, as you know, people, no, I'm funny. People in the ancient world, as in the not too distant ancient world, you know, it was not uncommon, was it, to marry your first cousin or something? Ever watched Downton Abbey? Anyway, there's lots of ways you could explain. You know, it's not like it's impossible, or it's not even remotely implausible that there would be different routes that you could take to get to Jesus. And there have been attempts to explain it. I don't myself think any one of them has the credibility to be a definitive explanation. What I would argue is that these are public records and easily refuted. And so it would be suicidal to the entire narrative to think they just concocted it. So it would easily have been refuted, and there is not on record a refutation of the genealogies, but there are a lot of refutations. There's a lot of intense disagreement with Christianity early on, and not to my knowledge on attacking the genealogy specifically as, I mean, people notice they're different, don't get me wrong, but I mean being able to refute them. Okay, and then he was declared to be the Son of God in power, according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead. So one, you see the parallelism, right? Promised beforehand that this son would be descended from David according to the flesh, and then marked out or designated or demonstrated or declared Son of God in power. Now you'll note I'm adding the little prepositional phrase in power directly to the Son of God. Meaning, I think the most natural way to read it is to say that Jesus was demonstrated to be the Son of God with power through the resurrection according to the Spirit of holiness. Okay, I think that's because, of course, according to the flesh is balanced by what? According to the flesh is balanced by according to the Spirit. Yeah, so there's a parallelism anyway that seems inherent in verses 3 and 4. And so in power seems more naturally connected, not to mention where it sits in the actual sentence, seems more naturally connected to the Son of God. Plus, after all, it just simply makes sense. Because he died, how does the apostle write to the Corinthians? Jesus was crucified in weakness, but he was raised in power. So, and the weakness and the power is being attached to him, right? He seemed to be weak and defeated by the enemy, but this was an illusion. It wasn't the ultimate truth. And his resurrection demonstrated not just that he was the Son of God with power as a result of the resurrection, but that all along through his ministry and right up to the very moment where he chose freely to give up his last breath. You remember that he asserted in the Gospel of Luke, he had the authority to call 12 legions down from heaven and to take on and save him from the arrest and crucifixion. He chose not to do that. When they arrested him, the soldiers themselves went back and fell to the ground, according to John's Gospel. He was the Son of God with power all along, not to mention he saved people from countless infirmities and even delivered people from death itself. He was already the Son of God with power, but the crucifixion left it open to some doubt. And the resurrection resolved for all history that Jesus was the Son of God in power all along the way. And of course, that was according to the spirit of holiness. It was the kind of power he has transcends mere physical, bodily power. That means, of course, even in terms of, it wasn't mere mental sharpness that allowed him to heal people. Some doctors are just wickedly smart and come up with a way to heal somebody some other doctor wouldn't come up with. It's not just that Jesus was brilliant. There was a spiritual power that transcended the body. And that was demonstrated in his ministry, but preeminently in his resurrection. After all, his own body is dead. So how could it be through his body or his brain that he comes back to life when it's non-functioning? You know, the brain of Jesus, if you stuck it up to an fMRI, wasn't giving you any readings while he was laying in the tomb. And yet he said to the, in John chapter 10, when speaking publicly in Jerusalem, he said, I have the authority to lay down my life, and I have the authority to take it up again. Well, how is he going to take it up again once he's dead? Well, that can only be explained if a person isn't only a physical, material being, but has another layer to them, who they are in their essence, which is a spiritual reality, which transcends the body, which of course was a common Jewish view and hardly controversial. But that you would have the authority to raise your own body, that would certainly be exceptional, or everybody would be coming back. Yeah, and then of course he adds his full title at the end of verse 4, Jesus Christ our Lord. We've run out of time, I just realized. So we'll have to come back and pick it up there. And let me just close in prayer.